Halo, Destiny, two iconic shooters that have done their part in affecting the entire global gaming landscape, especially within their domain, the realm of shooting and gunplay. Bungie has been making iconic shooters for north of 20 years, managing to stay relevant as a company in the process too. But as we have recently covered on the Death of a Game series, a series where we investigate the largest contributing factors to the death or process of dying of a game or company by utilizing a timeline of events filled with clues and bits of evidence. But most importantly, we activate our detective intuition, especially during the final deduction, where we crack the case for good. In case you missed any of the clues along the way, Bungie has been on the ropes as of late, with not only Destiny 1 having had its content long moved to maintenance mode quickly after the release of the sequel, Destiny 2, but with Destiny 2 having now also been moved there too, as of the summer of 2026. Throughout this drama, including their acquisition by Sony in 2022 for $3.6 billion, Bungie has been quietly cooking on a number of other projects. While many, including a spin-off Destiny game, would be cancelled ultimately, Bungie finally was able to make one of their projects stick, something they would do utilizing a long-asleep IP that once was the talk of the town in the shooter world, bringing many gaming innovations with it: Marathon. After a change of direction and course, Marathon would be delayed before finally dropping the following year, March 2026. But Marathon never got its own time in the sun, really, and expectations of the next Destiny title that wasn't to come, and the potential eventual shutdown of the game and series was weighing heavily over the release of Marathon and beyond. But besides just the player expectations placing Marathon on the guillotine, so to say, the game itself had some issues too, being unable to differentiate itself enough and find a lasting population. If none of this prior stuff had happened, we certainly wouldn't be covering Marathon, but considering the majority of the Bungie team left is working on the game, and because I don't think it's a feasible business product or video game to keep an entire struggling company alive, let alone even just in general, that's why Marathon is being featured on the Death of a Game series despite not literally being dead. Something that does happen from time to time in the series, of course. Marathon is a hot subject at the moment, with many detectives asking me to cover the project before the body is even cold. And so, detectives, let us get started on this case, as it continues to unravel before our very eyes. The story begins after the acquisition of Bungie by Sony in 2022 for a whopping $3.6 billion. This would include their flagship Bellevue studio in Washington with over 900 employees or more. Sony seemed quite high on what they could do with Bungie and their included IPs, especially because they had a long prior relationship with them due to their Destiny games on PlayStation. And well, 2022 was the best year for Destiny 2, and Destiny really, as a series, was the year the game's Witch Queen expansion came out, one of the most highly touted in the game's history. But to be clear, the acquisition happened right before the expansion, and was likely in motion from the previous year. What I mean is that Sony had likely put this into motion back in 2021. That was the year that Bungie had massive harassment lawsuit issues, and when they started introducing one of the worst practices in gaming history, a severe dagger to their own series, and vaulting. What on earth were they basing their projections on? Worse, according to some former Bungie developer claims, the company was facing insolvency without the acquisition, which seemed to back up our investigation into Bungie as a company through our other two Destiny videos. Go check them out, please. Especially when in a year or so time, they were already facing major layoffs and more. Bungie has somehow managed to do it again, after never finishing their deal with Microsoft or Activision either. They had managed to keep themselves afloat, despite the internal and executive issues that had plagued the game since the Microsoft departure. Marathon would be announced May 25th, 2023, and this was the first Bungie project post-Destiny and the first Sony project. Marathon was a long-retired IP, with the first game having launched back in 1994, and one that managed to introduce some unique innovations, such as mouse-looking. Yeah, mouse-looking, physics, and the coexisting of friendly and enemy AI. It also included an interesting premise and lore set within the game too and world, being a game about a large colony ship named Marathon that was sent to the Tau Ceti system to build a new colony. The story revolves around the three main characters, which are actually AI that were put in charge of keeping systems running while those aboard would be in cryo-sleep. Durandal, who was an AI put in charge of menial tasks, would go rampant or rogue, inviting an alien ship into contact with the colony, and then that alien ship would destroy most of it, and then spearheading the human civilization into intergalactic space warfare with the race of slaving aliens thereafter, the Four. The new Marathon wasn't set to be a revival, but a new entry in the same universe set in the same star system of Tau Ceti, this time investigating a lost colony on one of the system's planets, Tau Ceti 4, and also, according to Bungie, in search of riches, fame, and infamy. Game director Christopher Barrett, who was behind a few Destiny expansions, would state concerning the new sci-fi shooter that it would be a PvP-focused game and not feature a single-player campaign. Though Christopher would confirm the game was not a direct sequel to the originals, though it would still try to honor the original game mythology and story. To describe the temperature of this time, Bungie gamers were a bit confused at the usage of a Marathon IP, especially when the game seemed to abandon single player, which is what the game was previously known for. And why not make it a Destiny-branded game? We didn't quite know the game would be an extraction shooter yet either, which would only further the departure from the Marathon IP, and further confuse Destiny players who saw Marathon, and what would almost inevitably from this point on, become a sore spot for them, as a game they saw that was only taking away from the further development of the Destiny series, which is hard to really argue, right? Major layoffs would plague Bungie during Marathon's development, as Destiny 2 would be blamed for the company's underperformance, just a year after the company's acquisition. Total number of employees impacted was estimated to be around 100 employees too, amounting to around 10% of the company's overall workforce. It's during this time we would realize that Bungie had been, despite their acquisition up until this point, acting as an independent subsidiary of Sony. Further, the board of directors had been in support of Bungie but had become split, with Pete Parsons, the company's CEO, serving as the tiebreaker vote. The layoffs were issued by Bungie though, for example, which was almost worse in a sense because it spoke to a possibly larger oncoming inferno and that Bungie was struggling to keep running as a company on its own, which according to sources at IGN would lead to a fear of a total Sony takeover by the end of 2023. The reason this is relevant for the story of Marathon, besides it being the same studio and, well, video game developer in question, is because a total takeover from Sony could change the destiny, no pun intended, of the new sci-fi shooter, or put unfair expectation on an upcoming title that was never designed to be the video game that would feed Bungie's massive 800 employees or more, but it would soon be put into a position where they would have no choice but to do just that. While news concerning Marathon was quite tight-lipped, some serious news would drop in the spring of 2024, and that was due to some misconduct allegations and investigations surrounding game director and longtime Bungie developer Christopher Barrett, who had allegedly been texting lower-ranking female employees with suggestive texts, utilizing his position of power as an advantage. You know, a dork. This would lead to a leadership mix-up at Bungie, specifically on Marathon, with Joe Ziegler set to replace the guy that was creepy or whatever. Now, Joe Ziegler had recently joined the company that following year, where he had previously never worked on a Bungie-branded shooter. Instead, Joe Ziegler was credited as the brainchild of Valorant at Riot Games, a studio he would serve for over a decade. That includes being credited for the core design of Valorant, including its competitive focus as a game. The reason this is super relevant is when Bungie hired Joe to work as Marathon's game director, they were almost guaranteeing that that was the sort of game he was wanting to make. Joe had admitted in his departure from Riot that he had gotten bored of managing the game he created. He never said he didn't like the game, and wanted to move on and create more games, something he failed to do after working with the R&D department at Riot Games prior to his departure. Now you might say I'm over-exaggerating the claim, he would make Marathon competitive focused, like he did with Valorant, but considering his small track record of games, hindsight being 2020, and his personality as a person, it seemed like it was far more likely that that would be the case. Then it would somehow go back into the Marathon roots as a game direction, where it would include single player and so on and so forth. Despite being announced over a year prior, Marathon had not been shown almost at all. That was until Ziegler would appear in the fall of 2024 telling fans that the game was on track, but just not ready to show anything yet. More importantly, the same announcement, Ziegler would make the claim about Marathon that it's a game that's not for everyone. Which I think is fine to say as a game developer, and feels fine, you know, and fair all things considered. But the problematic part was that this expectation behind the game itself, which was that the new IP would mean a new audience. That was the ultimate goal for why they didn't make it a Destiny-branded game. But as we would later find out, almost 70% of Marathon's audience, reportedly, would be Destiny players. So if anything, the desire to split the projects was almost seen as adversarial by some Bungie fans, because the statement seemed to be aimed at them specifically, as most of the fans at Bungie at this point, since Halo had long moved on from their grasps, were PvE fans, not PvP fans. And well, Marathon was set to be almost exclusively a PvP or PvPvE experience. Maybe you can chalk it up to the fanbase being sensitive, and boy, they are a sensitive bunch. For example, I had people ridiculing me for covering Destiny 2 before Marathon, though Marathon had literally just launched. But I think Destiny fans and thus Bungie fans have a solid point, and, they're just very passionate for a reason. Which was, why was so much focus being put into a project that had such little crossover? Business was the answer. Bungie ultimately gave through their executive and design decisions, something I have accused Bungie of being more interested in already, due to their extensive anti-consumer practices, despite having some, as I already said, devout fans of their titles. Marathon would host a limited alpha testing of sorts April 23rd through the 4th of May 2025, and it's during this time we saw a waterfall of things coming out following it, starting with the reception of the game, which according to Kotaku had some good bits but left them scratching our heads, our being Kotaku. And also it's kind of funny because they actually said out, and this is like the first paragraph that's misspelled. But Kotaku, like many players, were high on the game's moment-to-moment gameplay, which was a return to form for Bungie, with miniguns functioning like past Destiny or Halo guns, and just the whole certain polish and smoothness to accompany it all. The alpha testers gave testers access to 2 maps. 4 runners, think of them like a hero class or character that offered different ways to play the game, including with unique abilities, and contracts you could fulfill for rewards and progression. Some players were likening Marathon, however, to Apex Legends, where you can lose all of your stuff when you die, which was a worrying proposition, as Apex Legends had severe player retention issues due to the game's insanely high skill cap as a battle royale shooter. If Marathon was even more niche than that, it was going to struggle heavily to maintain a healthy population. More complaints in the game were concerning the game's fast time to kill, which made mistakes just way more fatal, and fights able to just end in seconds. Worse, because the maps were rather small, think way smaller than Fortnite or Apex Legends map due to design and the fact that the game only allowed for up to 18 players to play in the same lobby, not counting the AI in the game, so the small maps led to monotony, boredom, and just fights that were at a super fast pace that you couldn't avoid. And then the design of them led itself to people camping certain choke points, creating zones of anti-play, where players waited and listened for the best moment to strike instead of making their own movements and actions. The art style in Marathon was just about the crowning feature of the game, controversially even, as it seemed to be either loved or hated. It was a contrast of bright neon aesthetics mixed with stark color accents and intentional negative space, or if you didn't take art in college, it has bright colors and utilizes them in a grim dystopian sci-fi looking setting. The problem being, the rest of the game is so damn generic. The UI is hard to navigate and even read. The UI looks like my friends modded it into Halo 2 or something, and the actual game systems are no deeper, with each shell serving as the body of each runner, aka player on Taw City 4. The idea is runners are manufactured mercenaries with programmable traits and personalities, and used to navigate harsh conditions on the planet instead of actual human forms. Originally, these runners would have elements of personalities that came from historical features and more. When a shell is destroyed, because your mind as the operator or runner is already detached, you just warp into another shell and repeat the process. This is probably the most unique part of Marathon, to be honest, because the actual execution was essentially just a hero shooter in this game now, where each hero has their own personality and unique abilities. So Marathon, great gunplay or not, as Kotaku would state, seemed like a shell of a game. And they, and myself, and many others would not see the feasibility of a game unless some serious changes were made. And that's exactly what would happen in the summer of 2024, when Bungie would not only delay Marathon, they would promise to make some serious game design changes to respond to the legion of negative feedback they had been receiving, with the new launch set to be the following year in the spring now instead. Sony shortly after would publicly reveal after their major Concord failure that the delay of Marathon and, well, their overall live service strategy, which was like the greenlight 10 to 15 live service games in quick succession, hadn't been going very smoothly either. And when you get mentioned negatively before even launching, delayed or not, by your parent company, it shows how much was riding on the success of your launch, which is exactly why the game was delayed, right? A serious delay like this means that those in charge felt like no other alternative was viable. But right before this announcement was made, there was actually another serious bit of information that would be revealed concerning Marathon, and one that also likely contributed to the game's delay, and many people's negative opinion of the game, especially from this point on. And that was accusations of plagiarism having plagued Marathon, coming from multiple artists, such as Tofu Rabbit and Anti-Real, all showing receipts that seemed to show some level of authenticity, such as mock weapon drawings, environment assets seemingly taken from artist poster designs made years prior, and more. Something that Bungie had already been accused of concerning Destiny, by the way. This would force Bungie to address the reports, as they would build steam on social media. With video game media outlets, Bungie would have art director Joseph Cross and game director Joe Ziegler make a public apology May 16, 2025, with Cross sitting there looking like he was being sent to the gulag after the video, with him struggling to even get his words out concerning his statement about the accusations of art plagiarism from trans artists, specifically, and plural. His excuse being they obtained a bunch of concept art and reference pieces that their team seemed to miss their due diligence on and crediting, which made it into the live build of the game in alpha. But this game was moments away from launching, and at this point having to comb through your game's art and redo it was not feasible for the company, which meant they were going to have to pay up or work to satisfy the artists they had wronged, which usually means crediting them, which they would reportedly do according to Anti-Real themselves, but I'm skeptical of that ultimately. It wasn't just taking some elements, it's like the game's whole iconography and high contrast coloring, which set the game apart, and is almost the only thing that does. I personally like the style of the art Marathon exhibits because it's bold and unique, but I can't help but feel this weird and sour taste in my mouth about it now. And while the entire thing ends up being ironic when the game is about corporations and their endless search for greed, and yet the art style seemed to be much of the same. This had done in my eyes irreparable damage to the brand of Bungie and their upcoming sci-fi shooter Marathon, and soured many players from even touching the game. Marathon would host their second technical test on October 22nd through the 28th of 2025, which would manage to be a much more positive testing phase for the game. But this and the previous tests were actually under NDA, with the NDA having been lifted on the first test according to reports on purpose to unleash the negative response that the game was getting, and only a select few video game journalists getting to report on the game publicly. Paul Tassi, the king of Destiny, would report on Marathon as well in his time during his technical testing, which was that unless you were already a fan of extraction shooters, Marathon had done very little to attract you as a player, especially when compared to another competitor, Arc Raiders, who had just launched the same month of the test and seemed to find a great amount of success in being closer to Escape from Tarkov, the extraction shooter pioneer, and yet offering a unique and challenging PvE threat that kept players honest too, and giving them a more desire to be cooperative. The strangest and most conflicting thing about Marathon, though, which Tassi manages to mention in his thoughts as well, is that the game is actually caught in between being more hardcore than Tarkov and less hardcore at the same time. I'll explain. More hardcore in terms of gunplay and gameplay, but more casual in nearly every other way, including you being given free starter kits to play. So who was this game actually attempting to appeal to? This essentially was a fictitious audience that didn't exist. A Destiny fan who liked extraction shooters already was a bit of a reach, but outside of that, a gamer who likes an extraction shooter who is harder to play than most, but less involved and less hardcore, which is sort of like the lifeblood of the genre? Worse, Bungie's answer to everything was that players would find it easier over time to recover from bad losses, which, sounds like you're telling people to submit themselves to constant thrashing, which don't get me wrong, I believe in this, I'm a martial artist and I also like fighting games, but that's a niche expectation and market expectation, such as, like I said, with fighting games, or something that's like more strategic, like StarCraft. While many people can be okay with that sort of thing, arguably, and I say this as a martial artist, most people aren't. Bungie would respond to the feedback of the most recent test a month or so later, where they would seemingly commit to making the game more hardcore, with statements to support this such as them claiming that players want more challenge. The whole point of an extraction shooter is you are challenged to even survive, which is sort of true. But when you have the ability to play a game fast and slow, aka camp and then kill someone in one shot with fast time to kill and gameplay, it's actually more hardcore already in some ways. Further pushing things in that direction might seem intuitive, but it was a bit of a trap. Bungie would also further state that according to feedback, we heard the feedback that the world didn't feel dangerous or lived in, which seemed to be them doubling down on making the game more hardcore versus more approachable. While these might actually be relevant decisions when making a niche product, Marathon wasn't a niche product, and it didn't have the luxury of being one, especially when the budget was reportedly $250 million. Meanwhile, Arc Raiders had cost 1/3 of that, and had now managed to sell as many as 14 million copies, doing so with an affordable and approachable price of $40 too, a price Bungie would actually mimic with the launch of Marathon. The last major changes to come to Marathon before the game would release in the spring of 2026 was the major shell revisions that happened in January 2026. These shell changes would shift the game from being a hero shooter of sorts with pre-made characters to more custom characters that you could select your own upgrades and abilities for individually through the game's shell model system, where you would choose a shell to inhabit, granting you access to their body and unique abilities that would come with it, such as the Assassin, specializing in stealth and subterfuge, the Destroyer, a well-balanced generalist, the Vandal, featuring the best movement in the game, the Triage, functioning sort of like a support, the Recon, the king of information, the Thief, focused on obtaining the best loot, the Sentinel, about area control, and finally, the Rook, which was the most unique shell mode, taking inspiration from Escape from Tarkov's Scav system, where in that game a player drops into an already in progress match as a solo player, risking nothing since you're given a loadout, allowing you to loot up your stash a bit. Though the problem in Marathon is that you are always given a free kit, so there's kind of like, you're not really forced to use the Rook system, which in Escape from Tarkov, either you go into things with like a knife or a melee weapon, or you have to go the Rook route, which is essentially just being a scav and trying to get some, little pieces here and there. The core difference makes Marathon a lot more about gunplay, if you think about it. But back to Marathon. Or with the implant and core system in the game, with implants granting you passive stats and allowing for up to 4 to be chose, and then cores allowing for up to 2. Which would then give you unique abilities such as turning you invisible when aiming or giving you a second charge on your grapple device. Cores are sometimes unique to your shell model too. And then you have the weapon and equipment system in the game, which allows you to customize your optics, barrel, and ammo on your gun, and what kind of shield and utility gadget you would take. You also have things like ammo, power cells, and medical supplies to fill your bag and resupply, which just about sums up the customization, loot, and loadouts of the game, which was fairly extensive in Marathon. Marathon would launch globally on major platforms March 5th, 2026. Marathon would score relatively impressively amongst both critics and players, according to both Steam and aggregate view website Metacritic, where it would score an 88% from fans and an 82 out of 100 from 55 different critics respectively. These numbers are pretty good, especially considering how little content was in the actual game, where the majority of the strength of the reviews seemed to come from the game's quality gunplay and customization. Some pretty major reviewers though, such as IGN, would rate Marathon quite high at a 9 out of 10, where in their review, they would describe the game as unapproachable, unforgiving, and off-puttingly creepy, but mean that mostly in a positive way, naturally bigging up the gunplay, while simultaneously talking about how there's plenty of room for improvement, like better onboarding, better UI, and more maps, which is just like, how are you giving it a 9 out of 10? And then GameSpot, who might have given it one of the most positive reviews period, just more flowery than IGN's I guess, 9 out of 10. The same rating they gave Arc Raiders by the way, where they would say Marathon contained excellent gunplay, phenomenal art, and a cool customization system. Though the strange thing was how different both of these games actually were, and were performing because of this. Arc Raiders has hope built into the fabric of the game, which has led to lobbies being divided based on the ABM matchmaking, aggression-based matchmaking, that pulled aggressive players with each other and non-aggressive players with each other. So not only were players choosing to cooperate with each other, even just without that, more often than not, they were incentivized by the matchmaking for this, despite no exclusive PvE-only mode. And to be blunt, the proof was in the pudding. Marathon had peaked at 77,000 players, while Arc Raiders had peaked at just 459,000 players. I feel like these critical reviews were pretty irresponsible. It's one thing to like the game, but to rate it amongst some of the greatest games of all time just felt bewildering, all things considered. Especially when it seemed like only people who played the game or liked extraction shooters were rating it highly, which seemed to be a very small amount of players. Though no mention of the game's poor value battle pass system from critical reviewers, which didn't allow for you to earn back currency you would spend to roll towards the next pass, would only offer one skin, and would oftentimes give you duplicate cosmetic items, being easily the worst value battle pass in extraction shooter or BR history. The game would launch with 4 maps, just 4. Perimeter, the open starting and training zone map, Outpost, a close quarters facility-based map, and Dire Marsh that was added later, which was a swampy area. And then the 4th map I will discuss very shortly. But really, you had 2 maps for 2 weeks at launch, which felt crazy for a game that was in development for so long, but wasn't far off of Arc Raiders 5. Still, it's not even really a 4v5, it's more like a 3v5, and even that was unfair. Why? Arc Raiders maps are huge. They're so big players can largely remain undetected at times without the need for invisibility. The tight-cornered map design in Marathon felt like it was purposely designed to force the fastest-paced gunfights as possible, which was only going to attract a certain kind of player really. But yeah, to put a bow on my statements, I really think the critical reviews for Marathon were just very irresponsible and totally off base. Cryo Archive, the de facto in-game zone, would be introduced shortly after launch, 2 weeks later alongside Ranked for the first time. Cryo Archive is the fourth map that I was talking about, and was located on the USC Marathon colony ship in orbit, which you would later figure out was abandoned due to it being attacked. Cryo Archive serves as the multi-layer dungeon of the game, not just allowing for players to potentially extract or exfil, as it's called in Marathon, with powerful gear that could net as much as 50,000 credits on a single run, the catch being the 5,000 credit buy-in minimum, and the challenge presented throughout the tier dungeon. If you make it to the end of the dungeon, you can fight a compiler, which is a 4 alien race member who was likely being experimented on by the AI Durandal, who we would discover was somehow involved with the colony on Tau Ceti 4, who if defeated, grants his exclusive weapon, rare implants, or weapon modifiers, and 8,000 worth of credits, and golden shields or backpacks. The rewards were grand, but not realistic for most players to even reach, with community reports estimating that this in-game zone was made for like maybe 0.5 to 5% of the player base, a staggeringly low number for such an important piece of in-game content clearly meant to be a large focus for the game. Bungie would follow up this major update with their mid-season update the following month, April 14th, 2026, and this update was interesting for me because it was a clear answer, I think, to the success of Arc Raiders, allowing players to now resurrect other runners and allowing for better group options with them for future exfils. You even got increased XP for playing solo now. The game would even add a number of contracts to complete for gameplay rewards on top of reworking Perimeter, the game's beginner map, to solo play only, still focused on the same though. Look, the mid-season update was a good update, but it felt like Marathon was playing catch-up to their competition. Problem being, the rate of cooperative play was inherently lower in their game no matter the concessions they had just made, because the entire premise of the game and lore was about profiting for yourself, or whatever faction you were working for, as a mercenary. There's no unifying goal like in Destiny, and the gameplay being hardcore as well just makes it feel even more unfriendly. While Arc Raiders was third person and allowed for more chances of a comeback or avoidance playstyle due to the higher time to kill and then bigger map. While fans of Marathon seemed to be quite happy with the game as the game struggled to reach even 20,000 peak players by May 2026, Sony would claim they were prepared to support Marathon with more content and not shut it down, while seemingly ignoring the elephant in the room, which was that the game only managed to sell 1.2 million copies compared to Arc Raiders' 16 million copies sold, or even Destiny 1's 6 million copies sold. There wasn't much to bet on here, with the audience being smaller than some indie developer games, and with the size of a AAA company at 300 developers working on Marathon, a $250 million game reportedly, for 4+ years, the money wasn't going to add up, and fast. But Sony couldn't just exactly abandon the game, when it could lead to the shuttering of Bungie altogether. Season 2 for Marathon would drop June 2nd, 2026, and with it, the introduction of a new zone in Dire Marsh, which would serve as a disorienting, horror-inducing new map to overcome, and the new Sentinel Runner shell. But most importantly to accompany the new season, I think, was the introduction of the game's new cradle system, which allowed for you to upgrade and further customize your runner shell as the season would progress, allowing you to convert weapons, equipment, and other items into XP for the cradle. I think a lot of live service games have something kind of like this, but giving the game a sort of economy system, leveling up the cradle, gives you access to the energy that you can place into 6 different upgrade trees: strength, recharge, dexterity, endurance, support, and resistance. Think of a stat or trait system. These new changes would help jump the population up to like 40,000 players peak, though only 3,000 more players on average, which I think shows how much burnout the game was suffering from. Which sure is inherent to the extraction genre, which I think is problematic, but seemed to be hitting Marathon even harder. Bungie had to pull out an Uno reverse card though and answer some of the echoed sentiments of their player base, which they would do with the announcement of a soon-to-launch new PvE mode dubbed Vault Breaker. This mode would allow you to earn vault data, utilized for upgrading your kit or gear in the PvP modes or map. This new PvE mode was experimental and set to be part of the next mid-season update. The thing is, as great as it sounds, the mode was supposed to only be temporary, set to expire in August. And well, each season came with a new wipe to all your progress, gear, weapons, and levels and contracts, you name it, which we didn't even mention yet. Also further contributing to the seemingly inherent burnout that the game had. This further feeds the whole feel Marathon was built for a faux hardcore audience, one that didn't really exist. Because how could casual players maintain their stashes while also losing so much if you reset their progress every few months? It just seemed like a recipe for a game that would only attract the most elite players, which wasn't sustainable as a multiplayer game, let alone a game that cost $250 million, and one that was starting to become the leading game in Bungie's fading portfolio. Bungie was already in deep waters. 2026 was the year that everyone else found out about it too, when they would cut nearly 300 employees, a third of their workforce, when they would admit Destiny 2 had fallen short of expectations, which had led to the layoffs, and them putting the entire Destiny franchise on the shelf, with no promise of new content or sequels to come. This was after Sony had just recently faced a massive $765 million impairment loss due to Bungie's performance specifically. Most of the Destiny team would be laid off, but even the Marathon team would be affected too, though Sony Interactive Entertainment CEO Herman Hulst would state that the layoffs were necessary to align the studio's resources with its current priorities and long-term goals, but that they will remain committed to Marathon and other efforts focused on incubation efforts for future projects. And if you want to hear more about how this affected the Destiny franchise, again, just check out the Destiny 2 video. But this didn't bode well for Marathon either, with the majority of the Destiny team laid off. All of the company's focus now had been thrusted into the lap of an incredibly niche hardcore extraction shooter, a game that was never intended to prop the company up entirely. Worse, if what they say is true about 70% of Marathon's audience coming from Destiny, they weren't going to be happy about these announcements, and the loyalty to Marathon might be even more fickle. But coming as a bit of a shock was the news of Ziegler, Marathon's game director, departing July 18th, 2026. Ziegler was going to move on to other ideas and adventures reportedly, and this is still a developing story, sure, with many in the community thinking that Ziegler was fired, and didn't depart on his own volition, really. Ziegler was set to be replaced by his assistant game director, Delchaf III, I think is how you say that, who would lead the game now alongside creative director Julia Nardin. But did any of this matter at this point? If the idea was that Ziegler led the ship astray, the ship has already crashed, everyone. And when you put someone in charge of things who likes to do things, a certain kind of way, you can't really be surprised by the end result, which is you, Bungie, made an incredibly niche extraction shooter that nobody asked for, no matter how good the gunplay is or not. And that's not a sustainable business model or product selling point alone. In the case of Valorant with Ziegler, it worked because you had a company not reliant on the success of the product nearly as much, and a game model that was far more proven with Counter-Strike. Marathon was even more niche than Apex Legends, though, and other extraction shooters and BRs. And Apex, for example, is a title that has often struggled from carrying the too hardcore label. Vaultbreaker would be introduced July 21st, 2026 for 2 weeks' time, and essentially was the Cryo Archive but without other players, well, unless you decided to team up with other players in duo or trio modes. Choosing to do so, by the way, was optimal since the game, PvE focused or not, now, was difficult as a solo player in the game, mimicking just about all other forms of gameplay too for solo players, including, PvP. Which just goes to show you can't really design an extraction shooter exclusively for one group of players, like for groups, or for solo players. You need a mixture of the two, or at least encouragement for players to work together or avoid each other in certain circumstances. This likely means having different sorts of encounters for different types of players. This new mode, though, was greatly appreciated by the remaining 14,000 players peak or so, and the much lower 5,000 players on average, but was criticized mostly because it would be a temporary mode. But this is where I'm gonna have to do my thing, and be the detective who says things people sometimes don't want to hear. Many fans of Bungie or Marathon, it's hard to tell sometimes, are quick to claim if they just made Marathon more PvE-centric or added PvE content, something that people also said with New World, by the way, it would fix the game. The issue being, at that point you have something similar to Destiny, and yet a highly inferior version of it. And if anything, even if they can add some PvE content, it's going to feel incredibly disconnected and piecemeal by comparison to had they just, copied like The Division instead, which had single-player content but was largely focused on the cooperative content in the game, and it had PvP in the form of the Dark Zone where you could lose your picked-up items. It was far, far more approachable, and it wasn't even an extraction shooter, technically. I really think people would have given that game more of a chance than this game. Hell, even if you named it Destiny the Dark Times or some shit as a spin-off game. But instead, in the end, we had Bungie dedicate 300 of their developers and 4 years of time to a game that barely anyone was ever going to play, even if they liked it in the first place. And to address another elephant in the room, yeesh, I need to get these guys out of here. Extraction shooters are not exactly in the state of growth as a genre at the moment. Hell, even after their initially massive successes, Arc Raiders as of late, in July of 2026, only has 50,000 players peak, just 10% of the game's initial audience. Delta Force, which launched back in 2025, still has 120,000 players peak or so, and 70,000 players on average, though with very mixed reviews. And it also primarily relies heavily on the Battlefield as game massive mode that's included in the game, so it's not just an extraction mode game. The point I'm trying to make here is that extraction shooters almost inherently have a high burnout rate, and unless they can effectively offer another way to enjoy the game, they can't overcome that. I'm not convinced of them as a genre, really, and never have been despite Tarkov's success. My reasons being, a vertical slice of a BR, to me, doesn't seem like that much of a viable game design or business model, but that's just how I feel. And yes, people will point to Tarkov, which launched on Steam a year ago, and the game has been around for almost 10 years now, but Tarkov was a unique part of internet culture, built from the community up, much like DayZ was for its time. These games have permeated the cultural zeitgeist in ways that most games can't even dream of, which is oftentimes why they are orders of magnitude larger than their competition in the same spaces. I'm just not convinced one long-lasting internet icon of an extraction shooter is proof of an industry existing exactly. And if you want to respond with what about Arc Raiders, my response is simply sure, but good luck making that success sustainable, which we have still yet to see with an extraction shooter. But the timeline has come to an end, detectives, and we have gathered more than enough clues to crack this case, even as the body is not yet cold. I simply don't think Marathon will make a large enough comeback with its player base or make enough changes to warrant a newer or bigger audience, especially not enough to keep Bungie alive on its own. But in case you missed any of the clues along the way, why did Marathon find itself on the Death of a Game series? A series that has always covered more than just literal death, since death doesn't just have one definition, remember? A target market that doesn't really exist. An IP resurrection that doesn't fit the bill. The failure of Destiny put immense pressure on the game. Bungie's faltering as a company put even more pressure. Stolen art. Questionable game direction and focus. Although I have no personal connection to Marathon 2026 or the series itself, this video ending has given me quite the solemn feeling, unexpectedly, and I think that's because we are getting closer to a reality where Bungie might not exist in video game development. Although I have been one of those to point out how poor they have treated their fan base and business partners, over time, still, I'm a gamer and a consumer, and I've enjoyed their products and influence on gaming over the years. Marathon might very well mark the end for Bungie, and man, does it feel weird to go out on a game that was never destined to be anything more than niche. Thanks for watching, and let me know in the comments below your thoughts on Marathon in case I miss any of the reasons for its demise. Until the next case.
That ritual is going to tear down the veil. The only thing separating us from the Fade and demons.
We're too late.